Listo, ya estamos. ¿Cómo está aquí? Ok. Bienvenidos nuevamente a Johan Gaming. Estuvimos hace ratito queriendo probar Fun with the Fitzgeralds, diversión con los Fitzgeralds. Bueno, nadie estaba al parecer jugándolo. Quizás nadie lo hizo nunca. El juego lo regalaron hace un mes, pero no lo probé en su momento. Lo quise hacer ahora y no había nadie con quien jugar. Era un juego tipo Battle Royale. Entonces decidí traer Dagon, también un juego que tengo ya en el canal. Pueden ahí buscar la lista de reproducción Dagon con ese nombre, Dagon. Pero lo jugué en PC, no se veía tan fluido como sí se verá ahora que lo estoy jugando desde Play 5. Esta es la versión Complete Edition. Vamos a estar jugando todo lo que hice en ese momento, aunque no es muy largo en realidad. Lo jugué originalmente para PC, como les digo, hace 5 meses y el video duró 1 hora con 31. Bueno, pero ahí porque teníamos ahí estábamos en el chat conversando, quizá por eso demoró mucho. Pero no es un juego muy largo en realidad, es un simulador. Y es más sobre hacer clic en ciertos objetos y conocer un poco de su historia. Y también hay trivias por ahí que descubrir acerca del autor H.P. Lovecraft y el universo que creó, ¿no? De Cthulhu. Así es que empezamos ahora. Algo de las opciones que modificar, creo que no. Vamos a dar un poquito la gama aquí, para que ustedes lo puedan ver mejor. Configuración del texto, creo que está perfecto el texto. Guardar y salir. Los DLC los dejamos para el final. Cuenta con 3 DLCs, por cierto. Esos, por ejemplo, en la versión de PC, que es de Steam, no los tengo comprados los DLCs. Pero ya que compré aquí la Complete Edition, ya los trae. Comenzamos. Dagon es una adaptación fiel e interactiva de la obra de H.P. Lovecraft que se centra en el ambiente y la historia. En este juego no encontrarás decisiones complicadas, acción a raudales o gestión de inventario. Tu libertad de movimiento es limitada y tendrás que avanzar en la trama a través de lugares en los que transcurre. Vale.
I'm writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more.
X. Durante tu partida te encontrarás con elementos interactivos. Unos te permitirán avanzar en tu aventura, otros te otorgarán información interesante sobre el relato corto en el que se basa el juego, así como el contexto histórico del autor. Ahí están los iconos, ¿ves? Círculo, una ramita y la pregunta. Parte de esa información estará oculta. Para poder encontrar todos los secretos tendrás que enfocar tu mirada y buscar el símbolo arcano. L1 o L2 para acercar, al parecer, no hacer un zoom ahí. ¿Aquí hay algo?
Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation. So that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners.
Ok. Vamos a ver. La pregunta se convierte en ramita, a ver. The Seeker, trofeo. Los hunos eran nómadas de la Asia Central que establecieron su dominio en Europa e invadieron el Imperio Romano en el siglo V después de Cristo. Se les conocía como guerreros letales y crueles, expertos en ataques rápidos, que también desarrollaron potentes arcos compuestos, lazos y armas de asedio primitivas. Durante la Primera Guerra Mundial, los británicos utilizaron la palabra huno como sinónimo de alemán, para hacer hincapié en su brutalidad. Sin embargo, el término se originó cuando el emperador Guillermo II de Alemania dio un discurso a sus tropas el 27 de julio de 1900, antes de embarcarse a China. Si alguna vez os encontrarais con el enemigo, lo derrotaréis. No habrá cuartel, no se harán prisioneros, todo aquel que caiga en vuestras manos será derrotado. Tal y como hace 1000 años. Los hunos del rey Atila celebraron una fama que todavía permanece intacta en la historia y las leyendas. Afirmad vuestra condición de alemanes en China para que ningún chino se vuelva a atrever a mirar a los ojos a un alemán. La negativa a ser prisioneros era una clara violación de las leyes y costumbres de guerra, adoptadas durante la primera conferencia de La Haya en 1899. Puedes leer las curiosidades que descubras al instante o retomarlas más tarde desde el menú principal. Si las curiosidades te distraen de la historia, puedes hacer que no se muestren. Esto se puede cambiar en cualquier momento en las opciones. Vale.
So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone, in a small boat, with water and provisions for a good length of time.
Acá creo que tengo que hacer algo, a ver. Aquí.
When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings.
Ahí hubo un trofeo, Solitude in Unbroken Blue. Como soledad en un azul irrompible, inquebrantable.
Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight.
No puedo dar toda la vuelta aquí. Ahí hay algo.
The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue.
Ajá, eso era casi el nombre del trofeo, Unbroken Blue, ininterrumpida inmensidad azul.
The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know. For my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awoke, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air, and in the rotting soil, a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other, less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for which innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, straining my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert.
¿De un animal eso, no?
That night, I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance. An intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night. But ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again. And in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me. But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost, and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of only a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual.
Voy bajando.
Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps, where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself. But I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express. For despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm. And revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me and unlike anything I'd ever seen in books. Consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound.
Su narrativa. Dagon presenta muchos de los temas y métodos narrativos que Lovecraft empleó y desarrolló en obras posteriores. Entre ellos se encuentran contar la historia a través de inscripciones, en las montañas de la locura, la ciudad sin nombre. El uso de diarios o notas de los personajes, en la noche de los tiempos, el morador de las tinieblas, islas que emergen del mar, la llamada de Cthulhu, seres ficticios o deidades tomadas de mitologías o eventos reales, por ejemplo, los Migo, en el que susurra en la oscuridad. Bueno, lo que está en letra cursiva son los títulos de sus obras. El libro se llamó El que susurra en la oscuridad, ¿no? Y ahí se presentan a los Migo, dice. También se considera a Dagon como la piedra angular de los archiconocidos mitos de Cthulhu. Además, muchos de los relatos de Lovecraft terminan de manera similar a Dagon, pero no diremos más detalles para no arruinaros el final. Bueno. ¿No hay más? Ok.
Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background. For one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then, suddenly, I saw it.
¿Qué vi? No, ¿qué vi?
With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters.
Miércoles.
It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the sloping cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. Distinct recollections of a great storm sometime after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard pearls of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital. Brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean.
Delirious but free, salió un trofeo allí. Delirante pero libre.
In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing. Nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god.
Dagon o Dagon era la deidad principal de los filisteos, que era adorada en el Oriente Medio como el antiguo dios de la fertilidad y de las cosechas. En hebreo, la palabra Dagon era un nombre común para referirse al grano. Los reyes de Acadia, Mesopotamia, lo eligieron como el santo patrón de sus conquistas bélicas. También se le menciona como el juez de los muertos en un poema asirio y como guarda de una prisión del inframundo en un texto babilonio. A menudo se le suele confundir con un dios pez debido a la incorrecta interpretación de su nombre, ya que en hebreo la palabra Dag significa pez. En la obra de H.P. Lovecraft, Dagon es una deidad submarina que gobierna sobre los profundos, una raza humanoide con rasgos de peces que habita en los océanos. La orden esotérica de Dagon, una secta secreta, lo adora como un dios.
But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries.
August Derleth y los mitos de Cthulhu. August Derleth fue un escritor y antologista estadounidense, era amigo de Lovecraft y publicó muchas de sus obras en su editorial Arkham House. Pese a que fue un personaje clave en hacer que las obras de Lovecraft saltaran a la fama, no está exento de controversia. Una de sus acciones más cuestionadas es la introducción del concepto de la lucha del bien contra el mal. Derleth era un católico muy devoto, ¿no? Entonces dice que una de sus acciones más cuestionadas es la introducción del concepto de la lucha del bien contra el mal a los mitos de Cthulhu, un concepto que chocaba mucho con la visión que Lovecraft tenía sobre el mundo y sobre el horror cósmico. Como resultado, muchas de las obras del autor han sido comprendidas y representadas de forma errónea en la cultura actual. Cabe destacar que Lovecraft nunca quiso crear una mitología y que el término mito de Cthulhu fue acuñado por Derleth cuando el autor dejó el plano mortal. Interesante.
It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often, I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm. A mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down into their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. At the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window!
Trofeo, From Madness to Oblivion, de la locura al olvido. Gracias por jugar, esperamos que hayas disfrutado de tu inmersión en nuestra pequeña piscina de horror cósmico. Bien, aquí vamos a dejar este directo, hemos terminado la historia principal, que es la que habíamos jugado hace 5 meses para, bueno, en su versión de PC de Steam. Vamos a estar trayendo los pendientes DLCs, que son 3 en estos días. Espero que el video les haya gustado, no olviden dejar su like si les gustó, compartir el video, recomendar el canal y suscribirse si aún no lo han hecho. Aquí hay trivia, dice desbloquear. Ya es lo que he ido por ahí recolectando, ¿no? Los unos. Si han habido cosas que me he pasado, creo que van a estar en los otros. Bueno, en los DLCs al parecer. Pero tengo algunos ya desbloqueados. Los unos, por ejemplo, su narrativa. Dagon, y por acá fue August Derleth y los mitos de Cthulhu. Nos vemos la próxima, bye bye.